You better book it out for the edge of town right now. Connor's men are hot for you right now. They're gonna be coming after you with hot heaters. And take a gat. Waste no time. You better skip to it. That's the straight dope. And don't come around here asking for any scratch. You're not gonna get it. Now scram before I pop you.
I think probably the only context that the Hokey Pokey wouldn't be like terribly white and square would be in a good like college marching band, because like they could probably do something fun with it, and like pretty much any good marching band can ennoble a bad song.
Yeah, I read, like, imagine FAMU doing the Hokey Pokey. I think they would swing it like a New Orleans sort of like womp 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 womp.
And then, of course,
somebody jumps up and does a split. You know, somebody's breakdancing.
Like, there's like some breakdancing, backflips. Hilarious to think of what the Stanford marching band would do to the Hokey Pokey.
I imagine the Stanford marching band is a rather white marching band, but
it is. But they are known for insanely off-color and like very risque. They at Notre Dame once, they did a cover of Somebody's Hung Up on You and ran a crucifixion pageant at the same time during the halftime show.
With all due respect to my Christian friends, that is a funny burn.
They really know how to push it.
I hope Jesus doesn't force me to spend a few years in purgatory for laughing about that. Shall we get into this?
Yeah, let's book it. That's a verb that I think showed up in this book, but only in policing procedures.
Well, there's that, but there's probably something like, you better book it out for the edge of town right now. Connor's men are hot for you right now. They're going to be coming after you with hot heaters. And take a gat. Waste no time. You better skip to it. That's the straight dope. And don't come around here asking for any scratch. You're not going to get it. Now scram before I pop you.
If he killed Whisper for killing the girl, that marks him off. Besides, she had bruises on her wrist and cheek, and he wasn't strong enough to rough her.
I was surprised at how much of that I could follow. And I think it's from watching a lot of movies. And I also think that I'm somebody, when I notice a new piece of slang, my brain files it away. I'm like, oh, there are a few like that. Even the use of after is very similar to the use of after in contemporary Irish slang. Like, oh, he's after getting a bruising, like it's like he's after, as in, if you keep this up, this is what's going to happen. And I think they still use that in Ireland. Of course, a lot of these characters are Irish immigrants. So, but anyway, we should just say we are talking about Dashiell Hammett's Red Harvest, the whole thing. We're not going to break it. Book, I would say it's right on the edge of this sort of length. But I'm glad that we're not talking about this one twice. I don't really think it needs two conversations. Nope. And yeah, it starts out with an unnamed private investigator. He works for the Continental Agency, which is a thinly veiled sort of stand-in for the Pinkertons. Private detective agency. He's been called into a frontier mining town in Wyoming, Montana,
Utah. They laid out for Ogden at some point. It's not far from San Francisco. There's a lot of talk about Salt Lake City.
Somewhere in the Mountain West, right? But not California. Yeah. Town, and he's sent there. He's been hired by somebody named Don Wilson. But he never gets to meet Don Wilson, because between the time he arrives in town and tries to meet Don Wilson, somebody murders Don Wilson. Don Wilson is the son of Elihu Wilson, a mining magnate. We also learned that he has recently come out on top in a conflict with the local union led by the IWW, the Wobblies. This is based on a true series of events, actually. The Anaconda Road Massacre. So our detective solves the murder, but then Elihu Wilson, it feels that some of the other powers that be in the town are behind the murder, so he hires the detective with $10,000 to basically clean up the town. And Wilson secures a certified check, which means no takesy-backsies, sends it to his employers, and sure enough, Wilson withdraws the offer, but our detective is kind of like, yeah, I'm going to keep, he can't stop me. I'm going to keep cleaning up the town, and I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, our narrator gets involved in I think the most charitable way to describe it is a Baroque series of intrigues.
Baroque, Byzantine.
That involve the criminals and the cops, who are almost completely corrupt, who run the town. The town is called Personville, but very early on is relabeled Poisonville, because our narrator is speaking to somebody with like a thick New Jersey accent who lives in Utah and calls it Poisonville.
Which not entirely unsurprising. This was still the frontier, and you are probably going to have a lot of working class, Northerners and Southerners coming to towns like this, in search of quick money and jobs and things like that.
And and the moniker sticks.
Yeah.
Personville is very clearly sort of Poisonville. Our narrator gets somewhat romantically entangled with a woman named Dinah Brand, who might be a prostitute, who knows, but she's definitely involved in all the intrigues in town. She's incredibly money hungry. Our narrator spends a night with her, but he blacks out from booze and laudanum. He wakes up, she's dead with a ice pick in her heart. He thinks he may have done the crime, but he's not sure. And the rest of the novel involves him making sure that everybody is dead.
Yeah, I mean, he does actually try to figure out who the murderer is. He's a little bit worried that he was the murderer. And he's also, you described this Byzantine or Baroque series of intrigues. Mostly what he's doing is setting these various gangsters and cops and corrupt cops against one another and letting them fight it out. And occasionally he gets pulled into that where his own life is in danger. My feeling is if this were realistic, his chances of survival, the number of encounters that he sets up in which there is gunplay or violence would be... It's like, give him like a 60% chance of surviving each, and he would very likely be dead, because there's this rhythm to it, which is sort of like, there's some tough talk, somebody threatens somebody, something, gunplay, somebody's dead, the detective eats breakfast, Dinah Brand asks for money, something, tough talk, somebody ends up dead, the detective eats dinner, has a drink, Dinah Brand asks for money. And we get that for, about 100 pages.
Yeah, in many different locations.
Lots of characters.
Yeah, so much alcohol.
A lot of booze.
They all should be dead.
A lot of reference to sex, no actual sex. A lot of violence. I didn't count at one point the body count is 16, but that's like 2/3 of the way through.
That's early on.
Yeah, I think
that's
it goes up.
At the boxing match, it's 16. Yeah. And by the end of it, it's like almost all of the principal gangsters are dead. Many of their lieutenants are dead. The chief of police is dead. Dinah Brand is dead. It's just it is Tarantino-esque.
Yeah.
It's like Kill Bill Tarantino, where there's just the body count is part of the scene.
Or it's like Hamlet, if Hamlet calls Fortinbras and then just kind of buggers off to the nearest town to let him sort of mop up the details without actually dying. So let's get in. I mean, we could talk more about the plot, but let's get into our analysis, and we'll probably listen to this plot is just too complex to summarize.
Yeah.
And I think there are interesting moments in this book. I don't actually really find the plot to be very interesting as a story. And before we, though, get into our various recaps and things like that, we should just warn you, this book is full of sexism, it's full of misogyny. Was there racism? I don't remember.
Yeah. Early on, the narrator says something about checking in on some slants.
Yeah.
There's a lot of WAP and Dago talk. It's not great.
Yeah.
It's 1929. It's Dashiell Hammett's very first novel. It's his debut novel.
Yeah.
None of that excuses it, but it can contextualize the unacceptable language.
Yeah, and it's represented as this is a corrupt, rough, violent place, and I think a lot of that language is in there to to create that sense, to create that context too. So I don't necessarily think that the author approves of it, but I don't necessarily think the author disapproves of it. It's just sort of like, yeah, this is what it's like in this sort of world.
Yeah. My question for you about the narrator is, what do you know about this? Like, as a character, who is this guy?
We know very little about him. And actually, this relates to a realization that I had about halfway through the book, which is I don't really know what's at stake here. The narrator is smart. He's street smart. He can figure the angles, as they say in this kind of story. He is 40. We learn at one point, because he says at 40, I could sometimes substitute gin for sleep, but not as well as I used to, or something to that effect. There are some good throwaway one-liners in this book.
That's my favorite part of this book. There are some single sentences that I just found. I was like, ooh, nailed it.
Yeah, for sure. He is overweight. He's shorter than Dinah Brand, and Dinah Brand seems to have an athletic build, and they both body shame each other, sort of.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about muscular thighs.
Yeah, it's sort of flirting, I think. Like, it's meant to be, because they kind of like each other a little bit. I don't think they ever do anything romantic, but there's an attraction between them, even though she's sort of using him for money. He's using her for information, but they also, I think, sort of like, okay, let's set aside business and have a drink together. They sort of enjoy each other's company. I also feel like he respects her as some sort of, maybe even like an equal in his intelligence, and that's rare. Maybe Whisper is the only other character who he sees as sort of a... there are a lot of characters. Reading this book, I developed a new formula, which is basically like 100 pages or less. You can give your readers 3 characters to follow. Maybe 4, but probably 3, and then you get another 1 for every 100 pages. And this is probably, like 300 pages, 200 pages, and I think there are something like 12 characters whose characterization we're supposed to track and remember who they are to other people.
Yeah,
and
Lou Card, Pete the Finn, Whisper,
Noonan,
McGraw,
the Lunger,
McSwain,
Dan
Ike
Rolfe,
Bush,
the Lunger, Ike Bush,
Dinah Brand, another woman,
the French wife,
early on, right? The French wife, right? I forgot
the
about
lawyer
her.
with 3 names, the blackmailing lawyer who is both introduced and then very quickly dispensed of. The 2 Dicks from the other Continental Men,
Mickey
and Dick.
Dick, I think.
Yeah. It's one of them who's kind of a nice guy. Yeah, Reno.
That's right.
Who's actually kind of a major character, and I will say in Dashiell Hammett's favor, I do think one of his strengths is characterization. That each character, if you're paying close attention, you understand that there's some you get an image of them. You kind of understand how they're different. And you even get a sense of personality. You get a sense of intelligence. Like, I actually think that one of his skills is quickly drawing characters.
Dashiell Hammett would be a good dungeon master.
Yeah.
Right. Like, this is, and I even texted this to you. I was like, this feels like a somewhat warmed over D&D session.
It really does, and it actually probably would be more fun because it actually feels kind of like a video game, like sort of progressive level of challenges, progressive bases. But yeah, we don't really know, and I think one of the weaknesses of the books is I don't really know what's at stake here, and I don't know why I should care. Although I have another question about it, but maybe my follow-up question to you is about the mystery. And not the murder mystery, but the mystery that I associate with this book which is why do people think it's so good? And to further contextualize that question, I went back and read a bunch of contemporary reviews. It's not just a popular book. It got a lot of literary critics reviewed it and praised it. There's a lot of, this is our literary mystery writer, coming from, now, not necessarily academics, although I don't even know if there were MFA programs in the 1920s or if there will ever be MFA programs again. And I don't know if there were MFA programs. I don't know if there were MLAs, or Masters of Literature or PhDs of Literature. But, the people who are writing smart criticism for the newspapers liked this book. And I admire parts of the book. but I would say it's not very interesting in terms of the plot. But what I do find interesting is the puzzle. Why did people like this so much? And I also think, as a trained historian, thinking about, okay, this book came out in 1929. That's an interesting clue. Where does it sit in the history of literature? Where does it sit in the history? It sits right smack dab between two wars. It starts right at the beginning of a Great Depression. Where does it sit in literature? I mean, this is contemporaries of Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Steinbeck is writing. I don't know if Steinbeck's quite published anything yet, but soon. So I have actually two hypotheses, but what is your best guess as to why people liked this book so much?
Yeah, I was wrestling with that question a lot too. I've read The Maltese Falcon a long time ago, but I know it was better than this in terms of,
and it came out just everything, a couple years later, right? Like
a few years later.
31, 32.
His production was, he did a lot in a very small amount of time. I think his last novel is The Thin Man in 1935. And I think he gets out 5 or 6 novels in those 6 years. And then he kind of goes and does he's in Hollywood doing script adjacent stuff.
Yeah.
But mostly agitating for the American Communist Party.
Right.
And trying to stay out of jail because of that.
Yep.
And so, but his work is...
This is not a communist book, I don't think,
No. It's
in fact, there's missed opportunities. He sets it 6 months after a violent labor dispute, and that topic is dispensed with in chapter 1, and we never come back to it, arguably.
I think the reason why maybe this was popular is something that you've said already. And I'm about to go on a sort of wild march of presumption and projection and all sorts of stuff. The pulp era, we're sort of in it right now. I would guess that with the Great Depression coming, we're in between two wars, the briskness of the action probably was one of those things that felt really new and felt really exciting. And I think there's sort of just barely enough good writing that I think a literary critic, it's like the thing when science fiction writers sort of feel shat upon when they get they're like, it's very literary for a science fiction novel.
Yeah.
And you're like, why is the bar lowered for the genre? That's so condescending.
Yeah.
And I think that maybe that might be part of it, that it's brisk, it's escapist. This isn't a novel that you read to think. This is a novel that you read on the toilet. It's occasional. And you could probably pick it up and not even care about where you were in the book, but you're going to get a few pages of really brisk action,
tough talk,
and maybe a little sexual tension, tough talk, and a narrator who really punches way above his weight. He should not survive.
And maybe that's part of it. Maybe you identify with his toughness. I mean, he reminds me of a lot of John Wayne characters in that he does sort of have a code of honor, at least at first. I have two hypotheses, and I think you just nailed one of them, which is he's maybe not as skilled or gifted as a Hemingway or a Steinbeck or a Fitzgerald, but he's more like that than a lot of pulp writers. And so he's getting credit for, you're a pulp writer who can do that. And in fact, one of the headlines of one of the reviews I read was Hemingway in disguise. And if you think about it, I think The Sun Also Rises, Hemingway's first novel, came out just a few years before this. And for 25, and this is 29, I do feel like Hammett's read Hemingway. The prose has a similar punchiness. There's a similar emotion buried under the surface. And there are a couple moments where that's explored in a really interesting way, although in my opinion, not nearly enough. So that's one of my hypotheses. Another sort of hypothesis is that he is a lefty. He is a American communist. He was also critical of the American Communist Party from time to time because they often would back Stalin even after it was clear that Stalin was a murderer. And so rightly so. You know, he was a communist who was more principled, I think, than the American Communist Party often was. But he also affiliated with them and agitated. And you could see it. I don't know. But maybe the stakes are essentially our characters taking revenge on the miners who went on strike. We learn that the miners, like some months before all of this happened, maybe 6 months, maybe a year, the miners all went on strike. And then Elihu Wilson, is that his name? He resorted to calling in a lot of heavies, a lot of gangsters to break up the strike. There was a lot of conflict. I think, you know, at one point, there's some language along the lines of many skulls were cracked on both sides.
It's one of my favorite passages.
It's pretty good. And in the very end, and this is all being told to him by a wobbly, who the detective meets in the bar, under the pretense of being a fellow wobbly, but actually being essentially a Pinkerton, which is interesting. In a way, the detective, the protagonist, is taking revenge, you know? And maybe that's part of it. Maybe this is seen as sort of like a revenge novel. Cleaning up the town. What does he do? He kills all the people who cracked down on those strike workers, except for Elihu Wilson.
Except for Elihu
who is
Wilson.
technically his client, and who he sort of gives credit for maybe being less corrupt than some of the others, but it's sort of like, well, he doesn't... Maybe he's less corrupt in the sense of like actively breaking laws, but didn't he break the strike? And we also learned that he had made a bunch of concessions to the union, but then took advantage of an economic downturn to strip away those concessions, and that's what led to the strike. And so all of that's interesting. I do want to read a passage that I have found that I think is, to me, this was the high water mark in terms of the Hemingway-like writing. So this is the moment where the detective, the Continental Op, as he is sometimes called, has gone to Dinah Brand's house or apartment. They're having a drink together. This is the night that he eventually blacks out, but he's not quite there. And he's already talked about how he has found himself... He's been setting up these different corrupt cops and gangsters against each other, basically setting them up so that they'll get in shootouts with each other or slit each other's throats. And he's admitted that he's horrified that he's enjoying it more than he feels is good. And then he says to Dinah Brand, look, I sat at Wilson's table tonight and played them like you'd play trout and got just as much fun out of it. I looked at Noonan and I knew he hadn't a chance in 1,000 of living another day because of what I had done to him. And I laughed and felt warm and happy inside. That's not me. I've got a hard skin all over what's left of my soul, and after 20 years of messing around with crime, I can look at any sort of murder without seeing anything in it but my bread and butter, the day's work. But this getting a rear out of planning deaths is not natural to me. It's what this place has done to me. She smiled too softly and spoke too indulgently. You exaggerate so, honey. They deserve all they get. I wish you wouldn't look like that. You make me feel creepy. I grinned, picked up the glasses and went to the kitchen for more gin. When I came back, she frowned at me, over-anxious dark eyes, and asked, Now, what did you bring the ice pick in for? To show you how my mind's been running. A couple of days ago, if I thought about it at all, it was as a good tool to pry off chunks of ice. I ran a finger down its half-foot of round steel blade to the needle point. Not a bad thing to pin a man to his clothes with. That's the way I'm begging, on the level. I can't even see a mechanical cigar lighter without thinking of filling with nitroglycerin for somebody you don't like. There's a piece of copper wire lying in the gutter in front of the house, thin, soft, and just long enough to go around a neck with two ends to hold one hell of a time to keep from picking it up and stuffing it in my pocket, just in case. You're crazy. I know it. That's what I've been telling you. I'm going blood simple. I think that's a great passage.
I can see, you know, one of my questions later is about where does this novel rise above the sum total of the words on the page? And there are not too many moments, and this section, the drinking, the laudanum, the wacky chapter about the dreams.
Very well described dream logic, the weird geographical, he's here, he's there, it's very specific, but but it's impossible, he's falling through the air, all of those things.
He nails it, and it's like the other part of the book where I felt like that happens is sort of the first chapter, when we're getting this kind of grand framed historical, and it does feel bigger than the sum total. And like, I don't know why you like that section, why you personally like it. I do too. I like it because I feel like our narrator is sort of detaching from his reality, and it feels like there are stakes for this one moment and the stakes are about identity. Unfortunately, he just appears to just
the only lingering bit of that, I think, in the final third. This happens about a third or 2/3 of the way through, and basically it then sets us on the third act, I think, which is the Dinah Brand's been murdered. He kind of likes her. There's a lot of evidence that points to him, and he's not even so sure himself that he hasn't done it. All the framing, who actually did it, that stuff's not that interesting. And I think part of the reason it's not interesting is that Hammett doesn't write particularly suspensefully, nor do you necessarily care about any of the characters that much, including the detective, except for, I also think, his wonder. Did I get blacked out and kill her myself? Like, that is actually compelling and interesting, and it's underplayed a little bit, and I think he is doing a little bit of the Hemingway thing, where the only way we realize that he wonders is when Mickey, the other detective, asks him about it, like, why do you seem to be worried that you're the one who did it, you know? And I do think, again, that's masterful, but I think that's underplayed, and it's almost like Hammett got 2/3 of the way through this like shoot 'em up Byzantine story and got bored of the story and was like, what is this? It's like he got kind of bored of his character and decided to make the character more introspective.
But then, he has this opportunity with this woman that he has been talking with the whole time, and perhaps building some kind of relationship or rapport, like you said. He even describes as like going on a half date with her at some point, and there's a lot of will they or won't they, and he just doesn't care.
Or if he does care, he cares more about saving his own skin. And
like, he wakes up and like he literally looks over and is like, oh, the ice pick is like driven through her heart. There's not much blood. Like, it's the moment where I was like, oh, ick.
He could be doing sort of the Hemingway thing and the Joe Haldeman thing, where Joe Haldeman doesn't tell you how Mandela feels when he sees his fellow trainee decapitated by the explosion. But then they go back to the barracks and everybody sleeps with a close friend that night, but I don't think we don't get they go back to the barracks and the closest we get is Mickey, like 50 pages later, being like, you seem to think you did it, or something. That's maybe this is tearing him up a little bit, but it's underplayed. And I think, what I'm coming to is that I think Hammett has assembled a lot of really interesting elements here. And like we were saying about Raymond Chandler, he does have writing chops. The guy can write a sentence. The guy can do quick characterization. He's definitely, like, if you were going to give him like a baseball card, he would have, you'd be like, characterization, good, like good punchy prose, good. First I was annoyed by all the slang, but after a while, as I immersed into it, I started to recognize a kind of poetry in it, a rhythmic quality to it, and I started to enjoy it. That's, the Coen brothers have a real, a kind of appreciation, for argot, for slang. And I kind of started getting that same thrill, that same kind of like, oh, it's just kind of, this is fun. But it's like he assembled all these great elements on a table and then didn't build the sculpture.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's why I think the like good dungeon master thing is right, because like you're never assembling much more than like a sort of framework, with like and the enjoyment of this novel is almost 100%.
Yeah, no, it would be kind of fun to like imagine like Serge Kosnietz and Olmus in this town. I think you'd want to give them a different mission than just killing everybody. Like maybe it would be to try to help Dinah Brand, or to help somebody, like something a little bit more benevolent, or to actually figure out who killed Wilson and make the younger Wilson and make it harder, or figured out who killed Dinah. But like two sort of, in a way, if you could sort of merge The Long Goodbye and Marlowe's sort of deep idealistic yearning for truth with kind of the Byzantine arcane setting of this story, you could have something. You could have something pretty good.
I felt like mostly what we were doing was simply reading the last 100 pages of The Long Goodbye,
with the same attendant weaknesses.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is it just that like this was a more literate age, right? Like this was when most people read more, people were good. We know you could read like the letters of like, oh, here's somebody who like assembles buttons in a factory in Pennsylvania, and they write a letter, here's the letter they wrote to their mom, and it's beautiful and poetic, and like, dearest mother, the light above Harrisburg, Pennsylvania today came over the clouds and reminded me of the time that we were sailing together on Lake Geneva all those years ago. Anyway, the job at the button factory is rather drear, but the fellow next to me has quite an excellent high tenor. And you're like, this is, it is an era where people were more literate. Maybe they can just tolerate more plot. Maybe their brains they're just more expansive, and they can remember more than we can in this era.
Which would make sense. I mean, like this. I mean, when we were talking earlier, I was sort of like, it feels like kind of the first Avengers movie, where you're just like, or it feels a little bit like Iron Man, where you're like, oh, this feels new. This feels different. It feels brisk. It feels jaunty. And, and that's kind of where that was sort of my analog for it.
I mean, his sense of pacing is really, really good. I think if you think about how quickly the action builds in the first Star Wars movie, you have a similar sense of pacing. Like, what's the very first thing that happens? A door, one spaceship is shooting at another spaceship. Very shortly after that, like, the door blows open, stormtroopers come through. A little bit after that, the droids are in the escape pod. A little bit after that, Luke finds... I think like 15 minutes, like, Luke has found the droids, and like they're looking at the hologram of Leia. And like, you're like, man, that cooks. Like, that is fast.
The other moment I really loved was the boxing match.
Yeah, I like that a lot.
Like, the boxing match...
Back to Philly!
Well, yeah, that was my favorite part.
And everybody just starts shouting back to Philly, even though they don't know what it means, which felt very real.
Right, exactly. Like, that does feel, I'm like, oh, that 100% would happen.
Yeah. Back to Philly, Nick! And then the drunk, back to Philly, Nick! He doesn't know what he means. He's just yelling what that guy started yelling. And then they all start yelling, and then the boxer gets scared.
And that's what does it, is like you imagine what is happening in the mind of that character must be, like, terrible. And then he's like drops, like somebody throws a knife from like the rafters or something.
I felt like I've been reading one of those Fafford and Gray Mauser novels, and I was like, suddenly we're in a Fafford and Gray Mauser novel, just like instantly, like just a little like, which is actually Fritz Leiber, the author of the Sword and Sorcery novels, has a similar fluency with quick action and plot. Like, you read those books and you're thrown into a lot of stuff very quickly.
Yeah. So Chris's Craft Corner this week is, we've talked about the way that The Simpsons pulls a little sleight of hand with their plot structures. And I felt like that was what we were experiencing here. We are going to jump in the Wayback Machine and go back to 1993. So this is towards the end of season 4 of The Simpsons, a classic episode called Marge in Chains. And with the title Marge in Chains, you would not see that given where this episode begins. The first 8 minutes, a Asian flu called the Osaka flu.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. It was wild. Appears in Springfield, and some context for this moment. Marge is the only one sort of not felled in the family by the flu. And so she is taking care of Homer, Grandpa Simpson, Bart, Lisa, and Maggie. Everybody's sick, and they're all demanding things from her. And Marge goes to the Quickie Mart for supplies.
Mom, I need more OJ. Flintstones chewable morphine.
Oh, Monsieur Flobo.
Mom, I need more OJ. Flintstones chewable morphine.
Oh, Monsieur Flobo.
OJ, morphine.
Lobo.
OJ, morphine.
Lobo.
And a bottle of aspirin, please.
The aspirin is $24.95.
$24.95?
I lowered the price because an escaped mental patient tampered with the bottle. Oh dear, the alarm must be broken. If you could just move a bit to your left. 8'6". Oh, Sanjay, help Mrs. Simpson with her bag. And while you're at it, uske koate karaf teku.
Haji, ekdam farafaspat.
Mrs. Simpson, you did not pay for this bottle of Colonel Quickie Mart's Kentucky bourbon.
No, I guess I didn't.
All right, come out with your hands up. 2 cups of coffee, an auto freshener that says Capricorn, and something with coconut on it.
So what this episode is actually about is Homer solo parenting. And the virus is just dispensed with. Oh my God. We've been Simpsoned in the first, because our narrator shows up, investigates the murder, and very quickly solves the murder. And now it's like we're into something else. And this has a name. There is a term for this. And, forever I've been, talking about The Simpsons and talking about this. This is called an Act 1 misdirect, is the actual terminology for it.
Ah, right. Yeah, the classic one is Psycho. Also the beginning of From Dusk Till Dawn. 2 great examples.
Yeah, exactly. And I was just like, and a lot of the writing about when you use an Act 1 misdirect is when you're not totally sure that the subject material you've got is enough to carry the length of the thing that you've got to do. And I think that your example and The Simpsons in particular are playing with that idea. Because obviously the Simpsons writers can kind of come up with anything they want, and but there's same thing with Psycho and Dusk Till Dawn. But like you said earlier, there is a little bit of a feeling of Hammett kind of writing his way into the novel.
In one of the interviews I read, the other thing is that I think Red Harvest was pretty successful, but The Maltese Falcon, the follow-up, was very successful, and it got a Hollywood deal, and then he got interviewed a lot. And he speaks a lot of aphorisms about writing. And one of the things was people said, "Oh, you're a mystery writer." And he would say, I'd like to be a mystery writer, but I don't think I really know how to do that. There's very little, you don't have those moments in my books where, the murderer is sitting around with a bunch of innocent people in a parlor and the detective has to pin it on them. Often I just kind of tell you who did it, and if not, you find out within a few pages anyway or something like that. And it's, I think we're on to something, which is that, he had this idea for a setting, and I don't think that he really knew where the book was going, and so it sort of starts out like it's going to be about maybe a labor dispute, but then we get rid of that pretty quickly, and then maybe, because one of the first things about the Continental Op is that he impersonates a wobbly. He impersonates a communist, essentially, or an IWW worker, and we're like, wait, is he a Pinkerton? Is he going to be spying on the strikers here? Is that what this is? No. That's done in chapter 1, and they're like, oh no, instead he's this Wilson, younger Wilson, is hiring him to, nope. It's done. And then we get the really strange sort of inciting incident of the elder Elihu giving him the $10,000 to clean up the town, and then the even stranger sort of Elihu saying, you know what, I changed my mind, I don't want to clean up the town, it's fine. And the character behaving very strangely, being like, you know what, I'm going to clean up the town anyway, we've got your money, and but I'm going to do a good job because I'm an ethical guy. And you're like,
and yet I'm going to break all the rules of my agency and get in big trouble
and
with my
then
boss.
Also sort of increasingly break my own moral code to the point where I start to wonder whether I'm any better than the bad guys. I mean, and that's the point where it sort of gets interesting. But I think, it does sort of have a plot problem. It has a focus problem. It has a what's this about problem. And with The Simpsons, that's not a problem because it's absurdist TV and it's satire. But if you're trying to read a novel and you're trying to care about the characters, that is sort of a problem. However, I have a new hypothesis about what people maybe liked about this, which is that maybe it was sort of genre defining too. Mm-hmm. That we had detective stories before, but they were more about solving murders, and we'd had westerns where people clean up a town. I actually read that this might have been the first of detective goes to corrupt town and pokes around, and sort of like everybody's in on some kind of corruption, and the detective tries to clean that up. That is a kind of subgenre of the detective novel that has persisted to this day. And so, maybe part of the reason you and I are kind of like, the plot, and other people at the time are like, oh, this is amazing, is they hadn't really seen a book like this before.
Yeah. So I've got a Chandler quote about Hammett.
Oh, interesting.
And and so it's basically what you're saying right now. And Chandler says, he took the murder out of the Venetian vase and dropped it into the alley. Hammett gave murder back to the kind of people who do it for a reason, not just to provide a corpse, and with a means at hand. Not with hand-wrought dueling pistols, curare, and tropical fish.
That's pretty good.
The addition of tropical fish is like, well, is there
actually an example of a tropical fish being used to murder somebody in an Agatha Christie story?
Well, I think it's the thing that so it's what separates Chandler from Hammett, right. I think, is that Chandler knows that the addition of a truly absurdist element can complicate and elevate your work in an interesting way. And he just really gets Hammett. Yeah. He's like, okay, the thing I like about Hammett is that he gives it back to people for whom murder is not just a viable option, but an everyday option. Yeah. And maybe that's part of the thing here, is that this is gritty and dark and ugly and maybe a little more gritty, dark, and ugly than a lot of the lives of the people who are reading these.
I mean, I was going to say, well, also maybe this was based on a true incident, a labor dispute in which 16 people were killed. Although the then follow-up gang war that happens after that is not real, but when is Al Capone doing the Valentine's Day massacre? Around this time, right? Maybe, no, it's during Prohibition. So it's
early.
Yeah,
20s?
And so this kind of cops on the take, bootleggers, gamblers, all competing for territory and killing, that is happening during these times. It's happening in Chicago. It's notoriously in Chicago is the place where we really, but I think it's happening in Detroit, probably happens in New York a bit, probably happens in any city, probably happens in Baltimore, probably even happens in smaller places like Kansas City and Columbus, to a smaller degree. Does it happen in frontier towns? Well, I guess so, probably, if there's money to be made, bootlegging and all of those things. But I don't really find gangsters killing one another to be particularly entertaining. I enjoy it in pastiche. I enjoy it when the Coen brothers do it, but I think that's because they're sort of elevating pastiche to this aesthetic art. And you get a little bit of that here. I mean, the Coen brothers loved Dashiell Hammett. I assume.
Mm-hmm. And you also I don't know. I mean, the big action climax only happens because of a scheduling error. Basically, it's all this special coppers they got done fake busting Thaler out of jail, and they were on our way back and they bumped into us and we had a big shootout.
And that happens about halfway through the book too. That's the other thing, is that normally with sort of 3-act structure, you have a series of escalating conflicts, but kind of the biggest shootout happens about midway through, and then there's sort of mop up after that.
There's bombs that get thrown around. There's this. I mean, there is some real Keystone Cops.
No, the shootouts. I mean, they are all sort of you can just imagine nobody has a weapon more powerful than a pistol. I was even thinking when was the Thompson submachine gun invented, and why don't anybody have them? Because you could mail order them back then. Let's look this up, because it's one of those things where now if the cops surround a house, you're there's no way anyone's going to shoot their way out of that, but this was an era where you get guys in a house, you could shoot it out with the cops, right? Because all they've got are they might have revolvers, or maybe they have automatic pistols, but maybe they've got a shotgun or two, but they're not carrying a lot of firepower. And so, there are a lot of these sort of comical, 1930s era, and they're not comical, they're horrific, but it feels old-fashioned to us. Basically now, if you get in a shootout with the cops, you die.
Yeah, and one of the things I did was the depiction of how ineffectual gunplay is, and which is true, especially in this era, especially with handguns, you're mostly missing everything all the time. And I think he does a nice job of depicting the kind of panicked ineptitude of these shootouts where you're no, they're really dangerous, but kind of by accident.
Yeah, and I think that's still true. I think I read a statistic recently that in the Afghanistan war, something 1 out of every 1,000 rounds fired hit somebody. Are you ready for my show and tell?
Yeah, no, I think we covered I think we touched enough on my thing about where does this book lift off of the page, and I think we identified a few moments of it, and that I really do think that Chandler sees something in this and then really takes it and improves upon it and makes it his own. And I think that Chandler is the one that we're really no, that's the literary hard-boiled author. But you can really see, the bones of what Chandler is going to do.
I also, as I was reading this, and because, the title Red Harvest, and the fact that we know that Dashiell Hammett was a sympathizer with the American labor movement, at maybe at various times a member of the American Communist Party, you sort of think, well, maybe this is going to be a labor novel, And in reading it, I very quickly realized, no, it's not. But I actually kind of, in my brain, created a future Upper Middlebrow series of maybe what you hoped this would be. So what I've got, based on the title, and also just what you knew about Hammett and the time, 1929, In Dubious Battle. I don't know if you've read that Steinbeck novel. I think it's underrated. I think it's The Grapes of Wrath is considered his great labor novel, but I think In Dubious Battle is maybe even a more interesting portrait of the American labor movement. It's about two American communists and a fruit picker strike in California, and it's told from the two communists' point of view, who essentially show up to agitate. And one of them is an old veteran of this, and one of them is a young idealistic, organizer. And the older one has this idea essentially that if a fight breaks out between, the detectives and the strike breakers and the fruit pickers, that will galvanize a lot of sympathy. And so he kind of wants that to happen. And the novel really explores the moral ambiguity of that in a really interesting way. I think it's great. Also, the Milagro Beanfield War, great.
Oh, you've told me about that.
Yeah, it's a movie too, but I think the novel's even better than the movie.
It's a great title.
And then Matewan, the movie, John Foles, is that his name? John Foles, the director? I think so.
Folles?
Yeah. Matewan, which is actually similar in plot to Indubious Battle, but set in West Virginia during some of the striking there. And then that's a film. And then what was the other one I had on my brain along these? The River with Mel Gibson, which I watched recently, which has a strike at its center. But it's also about farmers. And I feel like those four are kind of like more in line with what maybe we hoped this would be. So maybe...
Yeah. Like same problem, same question. Like, is the Red Harvest like...
I think that's just blood, man.
Is it just blood? I know. Yeah. I was like...
Which is like kind of like you could call any noir book Red Harvest.
I know, yeah. It was like a junior in high school.
It's not even an agriculture book. It's about a mining town. Like it's not even about like farmers. It's just
like how about Red Vein
it's like it's like the kind of title that AI would come up for. Or just give me a title for a noir book. Well, one of the things reading this. And to Chandler to some degree, but especially Dashiell Hammett, I realized how much the Coen brothers are clearly influenced by Dashiell Hammett, including their first movie was called Blood Simple. I am sure it's a reference to that passage I read earlier. In fact, they said we got that title from Dashiell Hammett. And, you know, I've become Blood Simple. And Hammett talks about Blood Simple as becoming... And you know, he was a World War I veteran, too. So I think he had seen this, of people who are so exposed to violence that they become sort of numb to it, but also fixated with it. But clearly the Coen brothers are influenced by Dashiell Hammett, but they're also, I'm realizing, we talked about sort of the weird sort of witty people talking across each other dialogue of Chekhov. So I have this kind of, I now have this equation in my head that's like Chekhov plus Hammett equals the Big Lebowski and some other Coen brothers. So I have a clip queued to demonstrate that. Okay, so this is the movie The Big Lebowski. Our main character, Jeff Lebowski. It's about midway through. He's at his apartment. He's about to be picked up by his friend Walter, but he's noticed that this person has been tailing him. I forget the name of this actor, Joe Polito or something like that. We can look it up. Excellent sort of character actor. Has been following him around in a little Volkswagen Bug, and he decides he's going to confront him. So you're going to see Jeff, played by Jeff Bridges, coming out of his apartment and then confront the detective. Or, well, we don't know what he is, but we'll soon learn.
Great posture work.
Yeah, determined.
Get out of that fucking car, man! Get out of that fucking car! Get the fuck out of the car, man! Get out of the fuck... Who the fuck are you, man?
Relax, man. No physical harm intended.
Who the fuck are you? Why are you following me around? Come on, fuckhead!
Relax, man. I'm a Brother Seamus.
Brother Seamus? Like an Irish monk?
What the fuck are you talking about? My name is Delfino. I'm a private snoop like you, man. What? A dick, man.
A dick, man.
Now, let me tell you something. I dig your work. Playing one side against the other in bed with everybody is fabulous stuff, man.
I'm not... Fuck it, man. Just stay away from my fucking lady friend.
Hey, I'm not messing with your special lady.
She's not my special lady. She's my fucking lady friend. I'm just helping her conceive, man.
Hey, man, I'm not...
Who are you working for? Lebowski? Jackie Treehorn?
The Knutsons.
Who the fuck are the Knutsons?
The Knutsons. It's a wandering daughter job. Bonnie Lebowski, man. Her real name is Fawn Knutson. Her parents want her back.
Jesus fucking Christ.
Crazy, huh? Ran away about a year ago, and the Knutsons told me I should show her this. I found her. It's the family farm. It's outside of Moorhead, Minnesota. I think it'll make her homesick.
How you gonna keep them down on the farm once they've seen Carl?
We'll stop it right there.
She's been kidnapped.
They keep you on a farm once they've seen Carl on this.
He holds up the farm is like the bleakest, like, monochrome photo.
It looks like, it's like out of Steinbeck. It's like literally like, or
but you know, like, that's clearly a reference to Red Harvest, right? Even to like the Seamus, I'm a brother Seamus, a Snoop, a Dick, and like, the Coen brothers
like an
are
Irish monk.
they're poking fun at the antiquated slang of the era, but then playing one side against another in bed with everybody. We're describing Red Harvest. So
and you're right about the Chekhov stuff. The confusion about
what are you talking about?
Like my special lady friend. Oh, your girlie. She's not my
special lady friend. She's my fucking lady. Yeah,
I'm helping her conceive.
I'm helping her conceive.
Like it's like things Yeppe Kodoff would say.
Right.
Not about sex and stuff, but like it's the same. Just like it. In some ways, it's intensely illogical, but given the context of the sentence of the scene, like incredibly logical.
This could be a moment between Gaev and Lopakin, or Yeppe Kodoff and Lopakin. Like, what are you talking about? Like, what? Sort of talking across each other. One of them is answering the other one, but then picking up a thread from earlier, but that all done with this sort of balletic balance too, and great physical acting of both of those guys. Oh my
god, Jeff Bridges, like
he's so good.
That like face work with the Knutsons moment, where he's just like
Knutsons,
what? Like it's just I mean you also get the same spiraling sense of plot, like a plot that has no top,
right?
Which is the feeling that you get in reading Red Harvest, where you're like, oh my god, the only way out of this is to kill everybody. And then to just like fuck off back to San Francisco. Well, and like the Coen brothers do something different. They're interested in a different kind of development.
Although I think that often though with their pastiche, often the stakes are very low, right? And you often have this moment of kind of like at the end of Burn After Reading, which I rewatched recently too. There's this moment of where what's his name? J.K. Simmons is a CIA agent, and he says something like, well, I guess we learned our lesson. Although I can't for the life of me figure out what the fuck it is.
Yeah.
And
he also gets the great line early in that movie where like some underling is like, what you do with the body? And he's like, the body? Who the fuck cares? Burn it.
George Clooney's character is on a plane to Venezuela. He's like, I don't know why he's going to Venezuela. You don't know? Because we don't have an extradition treaty with Venezuela. Well, should we stop him? No!
He does such good... He's amazing in that.
So, and by the way, the character actor who plays the detective is, in fact, John Polito. He is one of the two, gangster bosses in Miller's Crossing, which is a masterpiece, Coen Brothers
Miller's
film.
Crossing is one of the best.
And I would say also kind of influenced by Red Harvest too, right? You have some of those, shoot 'em up, a bunch of guys and cops show up at one house and they get into a standoff. Come on out of there, like moments like that. Come on out. We'll give it. The dame can come out, but then we're coming in shooting. That kind of thing. Yeah, absolutely. But that's all I got.
Well, let's see. You are the host, so I think we start with you.
Yeah, okay. So let's go to trivia. Call up my notes. Okay. So, Dashiell Hammett came out of World War I with tuberculosis. And I don't know if that's due to exposure of a bacteria or because of, all the gas attacks that World War I veterans. He was in poor health pretty much from his mid-20s on. I believe even in his 30s he walked with a cane. He had a persistent case of tuberculosis, and in fact I think he was even on medical leave from his detective job when he wrote this novel. So similar to the character Dan Rolfe, who is constantly referred to as a lunger, Only a lunger can call another lunger a lunger in this case. So it actually, the tuberculosis did affect him, and he was very weak and not in great health when he was writing this. So what adaptation did he employ in order to continue writing the novel? A, he discovered that immersion in hot water and having a steamy atmosphere around him made him feel better, so he wrote much of the novel while in a hot bath with a typewriter on a breakfast in bed tray sort of laid across the bathtub. So that's A.
What wonderful dissipation.
B, he moved to Hot Springs, New Mexico, which was later renamed Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, but that's a story for another time, where he lived in a very modest cabin which abutted a natural hot springs, which he soaked in regularly. That's B. C, he arranged his furniture such that he could always get from his couch to his writing desk while always having some piece of furniture to kind of lean on, because he wasn't strong enough to stand up under his own power.
I'm going to go with C.
You're correct.
Oh.
The A example is a bit of a red herring.
Okay.
It is, in fact, true that Dalton Trumbo did a lot of his writing in the bathtub with a typewriter on a breakfast in bed tray. Another communist writer.
It felt a little indulgent for Dashiell Hammett.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
Did you see the Trumbo movie?
No, I didn't.
There's lots of great shots of Bryan Cranston as Trumbo, sort of like smoking a cigarette, be mustached, typing away at his Olivetti typewriter, like while in his bathtub.
That's wonderful.
I believe there's an actual photo of Trumbo doing the exact same thing too. It's like they Trumbo's a pretty good movie.
Okay, yeah, I will check it out.
It has a great John Goodman role in it, as I recall.
Always good. So as we've talked about, Hammett was part of the Pinkerton Detectives. Mm-hmm. He quit in 1921, but then has a second sort of retour with them. But while he was in the organization's employ, he was offered what sum of money to murder the IWW leader Frank Little? Was it A, $500, B, $2,500, or C, $5,000?
I actually had read that anecdote that he was offered money to murder Little, but I don't remember the amount, or I didn't read the amount.
I will give you a hint if you want one.
Sure.
It's a number that shows up in both this book and The Long Goodbye.
Well, I was leaning to 2,500, but The Long Goodbye certainly makes use of $5,000. The relevant figure in this book I thought was $10,000. Also, $200.10 is a number that appears very hilariously in this book. That was also one of my favorite moments, their sort of hasty negotiation when they're in the Mexican standoff, and he's like, $200.10.
Take it or leave it.
Take it or leave it. I'll go with 5,000. I mean, I feel like they would pay $5,000 to assassinate the leader of the IWW.
Yeah. You're correct. Yes. There's another $5,000 amount when he's talking with Dinah Brand early on.
I feel like $5,000 then would have been $100,000 now, which sort of a pretty good year's take,
Yeah.
That's kind of my sense of the significance of that number. It's not, you can't retire on it, but you could take a year off, or you could go on a really nice vacation, a very nice vacation.
A double ding. We haven't had a double ding in ages.
I haven't had a double ding since Paris, 1967. Chris Bagg, will you read this book again?
No.
Me neither. But I'm glad I did.
Me too.
I feel like I filled in a gap. Chris Bagg, what's next?
We are going to be reading the first half of China Mieville's The City and the City is what's coming up next.
Upper Middlebrow is a small point production. Chris Bagg and Jesse Dukes are two red herrings in a tin. Music by Ben Pajak and Jesse Dukes. Design and website by Chris Bagg. We are supported by Jenny Grieve and well, that's it for now. But if you want to become our second patron, search for us on Patreon or check the show notes for a link. I think that Jenny Grieve should always be in our credits forever, even if she stops supporting us on Patreon. I think she is our first supporter, and that we should always recognize that.
As a reminder, Jesse and I are both writers and editors, and we can help you with your writing, podcasting, or editing project. You can see some of our portfolios and learn more at our respective websites, chrisbag.com and jessedukes.com. Or you can enroll as a patron at the You Really, Really Like Us tier, which includes some one-on-one editorial time with one of us or the other, or if you want to bump up to the checkoff level, maybe even both. There is a link in the show notes. You can also really help us by just sharing the show with another nerdy friend.
Thanks, everybody. See you next time.